I hope, I think you got a good, you've been with us before, so you get a good taste of what a nice, I think, what a nice community we have of our trainees and the folks here in Boston who help to pull together events and social events and so on. So despite our pandemic isolation and virtual environment, we've been able to stick together. And we're really happy that you're here this morning. Once again, you've been with us before in the past, but I'm really pleased to introduce Bret Keeling, Dr. Bret Keeling, because he has a PhD in English literature from the University of Washington. And he's one of just our great faculty here at Northeastern who's taught across several areas of writing and literature. He has received a number of excellence in teaching awards at the university level, which I can tell you right now is not an easy feat to be awarded one of those honors. And he also received one at his previous institution as well at the University of Washington. So we're really pleased to have Bret back to help all of you as you start to think about your individual development plan for this year, which for many of you will include helping your advisor or you doing it on your own if you're a more senior trainee, of drafting your own publication for submission to a conference or a journal. And what we wanted to do is have Bret back again to talk about getting that kick started and getting that writing going. And how do you structure it? How do you start drafting it? And so Bret, we're so pleased that you were able to make the time to do this once again and be with us again. We're going to make you an honorary Protect affiliate, I think, at this stage of the game. So thanks so much for being back with us again, and I'll turn it over to you.
You can unmuted, sorry. Okay, now you can hear me, yes? I'm going back and forth, turning my mute on and off. Tom, thanks you so much. And Kristen, thank you so much. McKenna for helping me get all this stuff organized here. Just, in the chat, Kristen uploaded a file for me. It's a PDF of a research article that we can look at together. And I'll tell you when we might start kind of going back and forth between my slide deck here and looking at things on that article. But if you wanted to go ahead and open it and download it onto your desktop so that we get to that moment, we can kind of go back and forth. And then I'll just toggle back and forth between the slide deck and the article here on the screen here so we can follow along. So, one more thing, and Kristen mentioned this earlier, and I just want to say the same thing. Feel free to interrupt me. I think that this is, for my part, I don't want to say I'm unprepared because that would not be what I want to imply, but it is unscripted, meaning so I don't have anything, I'm going to follow along with what I put on the slides, but I'm not following, like, I don't have a secret document to the side that I'm reading word by word or sentence by sentence. So you're not going to derail anything that I might be talking about or trying to make clear. Okay, so yeah, feel free to do that. That said, if other folks can watch, because I might not, because I might be looking at the slide deck. So if you have a question and I seem to be ignoring you, then somebody shout out and say, hey, wait a minute, I have a question, whatever. Okay, so anyway, I just want to point, so the purpose is, as Tom was mentioning earlier, just to discuss sort of how to present your scientific findings by writing scientific papers. And then I included here because I wanted to make sure that you understand that this structure, I use the term, it's both accepted and expected, meaning that for the most part, folks in the technical fields have accepted the way that this is the way we present we present our scientific findings. And because we've accepted that's the way we're going to do it, that means people are going to expect to see it follow that same sort of format. And by the way, there's always exceptions to that. And then the second part of it is to try to make sure, just in case it's not, and you probably will understand it better than I will. I think Tom actually set it up really great already, but I want to make sure that that I understand, as well, hopefully that you understand, of how understanding the structure of the scientific papers could be relevant to your own IDP activities and also to the collaborative projects that you might be working on. Okay, so what is a scientific paper? Here, a scientific paper is written report describing original research results. And there are a couple of things I want you to know about this, which I'm taking from Vanderbilt University's library. So a couple things. Scientific papers are published in a periodical called a journal, whose purpose is to publish this kind of work. There are exceptions to this as well. Sometimes you will find scientific papers published in what are called trade publications, but probably not as frequently as in the journals themselves. And I will move on to another point about this here. Most of the papers they're almost always peer reviewed. And I think you folks probably understand what the peer review process is, but just briefly here, that means that the paper has been subjected to the scrutiny of several experts in the field, as opposed to like an editor looking at the article and saying, you know what, I really like this, I'm going to publish it. When it goes out to the other experts, they actually don't have access to your name. They don't know who actually is providing the work unless you, I mean, there are just, there are ways to sort of out yourself in a publication, but for the most part, it's anonymous. And it's for better or for worse, there are problems with peer review, certainly we could talk about, but for better or worse, it is the most rigorous form of review that we have to make sure that the scientific findings we're reporting are really accurate, at least for the time being. Third point, that they're citable. This means that the content is stable, the journal is readily available in libraries and through the web and such. If you find information online, for example, that disappears the next day, then that would mean it would probably not falling into the category or the genre of the scientific paper, at least the way that Vanderbilt University is describing it. They use citations. I'm going to talk about citations in a slightly different way later on, but you probably know this without me saying it, that there are all kinds of different citation styles or formats. There's IEEE, which a lot of folks in the technical disciplines use, but many journals, when we look at the journal article here, I'm going to sort of point out something very interesting about it. Most journals will actually have their own citation system, and they'll explain that to you. And so even if you say to yourself, oh, I always use APA or I always use IEEE, the journal you're submitting to may want you to do something else. So just be thinking about that. And then the structure, and that's the last point, and that's what I'm going to focus on for a few minutes here, following the standardized structure of writing and data presentation. And so the components of the scientific paper include these things. The title and authors, of course. There's almost always an abstract. There's almost always keywords. If there's one thing in what I have here that wouldn't be included, there are some journals that don't include keywords, but they will include an introduction, and it's usually labeled as an introduction. It'll include a methods that's usually labeled as methods, and sometimes they'll use the term methodology. Results, by the way, results and discussion can appear the way I have them combined, but they also can appear separately, a results section and then a separate discussion section, and then the conclusion. And by the way, sometimes the discussion, not very often, but sometimes the discussion functions as the conclusion, and there isn't a conclusion sentence or section. And I want to go over some of these things here with you today. So these are some of the questions, if you're asking yourself, well, what goes into the introduction, if you're putting together your research, these are some of the questions that you could ask yourself. So like, what should I be putting here? Well, for the introduction, what did you and your team do and why did you do it? The methods, how did you do it? Results, what did you find? The discussion, what does it all mean? Or this is where the interpretation of your result. And then the conclusion, and why does it matter? Why does it matter to somebody else? What are the implications of it? So when you're thinking of putting your own research together, one way to kind of get started is just ask yourself, how would I answer these questions? And then you can build around that. And again, I say you might be able to do this. No formula works perfectly for everybody, and no formula works perfectly for every research project. Okay, now if you've had that PDF that I asked you to open, why don't you go ahead and open it up now? So I'm going to go through a couple of things about the introduction, but then I want us to look at the actual research article together. So in an introduction, by the way, most introductions in scientific papers are more than one paragraph, which is not the case in other disciplines. So the first paragraph often follows this inverted triangle principle, meaning it starts with a broad statement and ends with a sentence that identifies a specific problem that the paper is going to address. Okay, that's the first paragraph. Now, in the middle paragraphs, the next series could be functioning as a literature review. Now, some literature reviews, just so you know, can be really extensive, and sometimes journals will actually separate the literature review out from the introduction. So when I'm saying here that the middle paragraphs would function as the literature review, that wouldn't be the case. But if that isn't the case, the journal will almost always go introduction as a section, and then a separate section, they'll identify it as the literature review. If you don't see a separate literature review, if it goes straight from introduction to, for example, methods, then that means a literature review is happening within the introduction. And it may or may not be extensive. Does that sort of make sense to people? You would just chime in and say no, or okay, good. I saw a thumbs up. Thumbs up always makes me happy. And then again, identify the significant differences between what's been published. And again, that may not happen. And then the final paragraph. The final paragraph often, not always, will provide a roadmap for what's about to happen. So it can either have a general outline of the contribution, or it can have a specific section by section breakdown of the remaining article. So if you want to look at, and you can look at it here, but if you have the PDF open, make sure, so everybody now sees I have the article open on screen, right? The environmental factors. Okay, good. So we'll just go through, I don't want to spend a lot of time pointing at every little thing, but everything that I was saying that many research articles would include, we see that they have it here. It has the article, we have the article, the author's names, as well as their credentials. In this particular journal, this is from the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. They even have a really interesting sort of date process. We received it originally on November 8th. We accepted it on December 16th, and we published it on December 19th. And the reason I wanted to just linger over this date for you for a moment, is that in your field, or in your fields, because I realize you're not all focused on the exact same thing, but there can often be a really fast turnaround in publication. And with so many things going online and digital, that turnaround can even be faster. There are other disciplines. For example, my discipline in the humanities, our research never turns around this fast. So I could submit something, I could have it, they could receive it in 2017. They might send it back to me for some revisions at the beginning of 2018. They might then accept it in 2018, and maybe it gets published at the beginning of 2019. But the research in the humanities is usually not as cutting edge and immediately relevant than it would be for your disciplines. And that's why you see folks making this effort to make this quick turnaround. And then again, so we have the abstract. Again, I'm not going to read these things, but you notice this one also has a keywords section. Some journals will call this index terms. I think that might have been even the term I used on my slide, but it's the same thing. And also just about the keywords, the journals will usually tell you if they need to come in a specific order. And I'm just pointing this out because, for example, IEEE says that you have to put all your keywords in alphabetical order. But some journals will want you to put them in, that's why I'm guessing that we're seeing here, wants it to come in a hierarchical order. Like what's the most important, keyword that people might be looking for. Okay. Now, if you remember, or actually, let me just ask, so does anybody remember, and I don't want to put anybody on the spot, does anybody remember what I said the first paragraph should do?
Broad introduction.
I'm sorry?
It starts with a broad introduction and ends with the specific research that you're going to.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much. So as you can see here, this first paragraph, the fecal pollution is a threat to coastal ecosystems in many countries around the world that carries important public health and economic consequences. So this is a large statement. And then they get to something more specific. This is what their research is concerned with. Inadequate wastewater treatment prior to ocean outfall discharge, inadequate wastewater treatment prior to ocean outfall discharge, ineffective in old storm water systems and septic systems that leak into the karst geology and streams in the region are a constant and present danger to the public. So now we understand where they're coming from. We understand what they're going to be focusing on. And then do you remember what I was saying that usually, often, the middle paragraphs will do?
It was about literature reviews.
Good. So they function as the literature review. And sometimes it's a little difficult to figure out if that's what's happening here. I want to point out a couple of things. So I actually think the literature review does begin a little bit it is impractical to measure and in the 2012 United States Environmental Protection Agency recreational water quality criteria. Phew. But the actual review of the literature, I think, actually starts to happen in the next paragraph. Previous water quality studies in Puerto Rico have mostly focused on infrastructure. However, there have been a handful of short-term studies, that is weeks to months, on a relationship between water quality and environmental conditions. And so here's where they're bringing in the literature that's specifically relevant to what, or it's relevant to what they're about to build on, right? And I want to point out, I highlighted some numbers here. So the numbers that you see in the brackets at the end of these sentences, these correspond to the numbers as they appear in order in the references section. And the reason I just want you to be aware of that, because this is this is an example of a journal asking you to format something in a way that actually doesn't fit a specific citation system. Does anybody know which citation system traditionally uses the bracket with the number around it like that?
Chicago,
I'm sorry?
Chicago, Moravian, and IEEE.
Good, and very good. So there are a couple of them. And so this, if especially folks, if you're used to reading a technical writing in an IEEE format, when you see this, you know automatically this is IEEE. And IEEE requires that the references come in the same number that you address them within the paper itself. Now, at the end of this particular article, I'm going to point out how the way that we cite the references themselves, regardless of this bracketed number, the references are actually different. They actually don't follow IEEE. Okay, so anyway, then the last paragraph, or the last couple of paragraphs, I just want to point out, so they break what's our purpose, they break it into a couple of paragraphs. So they state here, the current case study seeks to, they mention what their approach is, which is going to basically help set up their methods in a minute. And then they tell you this case demonstrates how something happens and it serves as an important point of reference for future water quality studies. Okay, and so when you're thinking about your own introductions for things, I mean, think out big, have some kind of sense that's going to lead into the specifics of what you're doing. But at the end of your introduction, there's an expectation from readers of scientific papers that you're going to be really clear. What's your purpose? The purpose of our study is, or this case study demonstrates it serves as whatever it is. Okay. And oh, by the way, I forget, the results of the study begin to fill this, and additionally, results can be used to develop. And this is where it has that sort of roadmap feel to it. It doesn't say in this section we'll discuss this, in this section we'll discuss that, which, by the way, many scientific articles will end with that kind of discussion. But if we actually, and we're not going to spend time doing it right now, but if we actually looked for, everything that they mention in these paragraphs, is this the order that they actually address it in the body of the paper when the results in discussion, and the answer just, it's yes. And I realize I'm asking you to trust me on that, but that's just because I don't want to talk about it. Okay, so I'm going to switch us back to the presentation slides here and move us into the methods. So scientific writing is direct and orderly. And by the way, I'm quoting there because whenever I hear things direct and orderly, to me, they're always words that should identify some sort of definition. What do you mean by direct and orderly? But I do like what follows. The method section structure should. And I like the words he uses to describe, to explain, describe, explain, to state. So the thing about the methods, remember, this is just this is what we did, okay? You're not describing what happened after you did things, and you're really not, you might do a little bit of talking about why you've done this, but you actually might have done that actually in your introduction as well. Does that make sense? So it's just, here's what we did. Here's what we laid out, whether it was done in a laboratory, whether we built a prototype. By the way, some of you focusing on public health might actually look at research that does what in social science we might refer to as field research. I mean, you've sent out questionnaires, you've conducted interviews, which are also fall in terms of ethnographic studies. So there are lots of different methods, different kinds of approaches that one could think about. I think that's my only, oh no, there's one other thing. Oh yeah, I wanted to include this part. So he also goes on to state, present the methods section as clearly and logically as possible. The description of preparations, measurements, and protocol should be organized chronologically. I think that's a really important thing to think about, because remember we were talking about in terms of what makes scientific writing unique is a notion it needs to be citable. That means it's not only citable in the sense that I can find it just like you found it, but it also means that citable in the sense that I could probably follow the same steps, right? And hopefully, if it's good research, I should get similar or the same results, right? So making sure that you follow that chronological order is really important there. And then I like this part as well, and we'll look at the published article in a minute. For clarity, when a large amount of details must be presented, information should be presented in subsections according to the topic. And the last sentence I included, I was going to get rid of it, but I felt that I was editing him or censoring him in a way that probably doesn't deserve, even though I'm not sure that yeah. The most to least, I think this is a matter of me sort of not being comfortable enough maybe with some of the content, and it's hard for me to judge whether it was the most to the least important. You might all be you all probably are much better judges than I am. Okay, so let's just take a quick look then at the methods section in our published article. So, and by the way, a lot of times we'll have materials and methods. So I mentioned one thing that will happen, and this is something or that Kellett was saying should happen. You notice that they're using numbers to separate. So number 1 was the introduction, 2 is the materials and methods, and the 2.1 suggests what to you? When you see 2.1, what do you expect to see after that? Good, yeah, exactly, thanks. Yeah, the 2.2, 2.3, and it's important that you think about that when you're organizing your own research, so that if you don't want to put a 2.1 if there's no 2.2, right? You don't need the subsections. But as you can see here, and let's just scroll through this together, you can see actually that they have a lot of things going on in their materials and methods. So they tell us where the study took place at, and they have a figure here. You probably already know this, but maybe I'll just mention it briefly here. There are 2 kinds of, in fact, I know some of you know the answer from prior to the beginning of our meeting when Kristen was talking with some of you. There are 2 kinds of ways that you identify the graphics that are in scientific writing. One is a figure. What's the other one?
Table.
Table, good, okay? Those are the only 2 things that you see in scientific writing. By the way, I shouldn't say that. I actually have seen other things, but for the most part, they're figures and they're tables. And as we'll see here, figure 1, figure 2, figure 3. But if I go from figure 1 and my next is a table, it's figure 1, table 1, figure 2, figure 3, table 2, and so forth. Okay, so anyway, we have this figure here. And notice that they talk about the figure. Right, there's a caption below it where they get into some information about it. So the other thing you'll see in most scientific papers, especially in the methods or materials and methods section, is that you don't let the figures speak for themselves, right? And that's true of the tables as well. Okay, so we had the figure there, and then they get into their second. So now they have a 2.2, and then this data were obtained from these places. 2.3 data were obtained from, again, somewhere else. And this is one of the reasons they're breaking this down is a lot of the data that they're using isn't data that they collected, right? It was collected elsewhere. In this case, the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, National Centers for Environmental Information. They tell you how they received, you found the sea surface temperatures, sensing reflection was used to do something. Another section here where we describe the use of different previously substitutions evaluated. And by the way, I did want to pause on this one because in 2.4, it's interesting. They're actually are telling you a little bit of result of something, but it's not a result of their actual overall experiment. They're telling us that we tested something first to make sure that we were taking the right approach with this. And so they tell you based on that it was included that the results, blah, blah, blah. Therefore, a conservative approach was selected. So they're trying to make sure they want us to know why they picked the approach that they did. And now we have a 2.5. And then we get into the results. So this is a fairly lengthy method section. By the way, it's not the longest method section I've ever seen, but compared to others, it's fairly lengthy. And one could argue it's a bit complicated. I mean, as a novice, it certainly seems complicated to me, but the authors themselves realized the potential for it creating confusion, and that's why they used those subsections. Okay, let's think a little bit about the results. And for the most part, and this is true especially if the results are separate from the discussion. But if the results and discussion are together, some of this isn't going to be true. But if it's just results, the writers would just identify and describe the results. They're not going to interpret them yet. And I point out this often appears in the discussion, but again, not always. And I think there's one more point I wanted to make about results. The common format for the results section is to present a series of visuals. So again, the tables and figures throughout the text of the section. And it's important that the tables and figures be accompanied by, in this case, descriptive or explanatory text. If you don't explain or describe the tables and figures, then the tables and figures are not doing the real work that you want them to do. And point here again, the writers still might decide to use section headings. So I'm going to go back again to our published research and see what they're doing. Well, we see that they do the very first thing that I mentioned they might do. They're going to keep going with these section headings. It was working with the methods and the results section. Notice we're on page 6 of their article and there's 16 pages. That tells us the results are probably going to be again, a little bit complicated, or at least they want to make sure that they separate the specific points that they want to make. Think about this if you were writing something much shorter, like just a memo. You would say things like first, second, third. This functions the same way. It's just, we can't put it all in a paragraph. And by the way, first, second, and third probably is not going to be as effective at separating your sections out in scientific writing. So again, we have a 3.1, there's a table, and again, there's a table with the discussion of why it's meaningful. Table 2, there's a discussion of why it's meaningful. And notice that they don't break up the tables, they don't separate them, for visual effect. They make sure that table 1 and table 2 are relevant to what they're talking about in 3.1. They keep them together and they don't move away from them to 3.2 until they've discussed them. And again, we've got a 3.2. I think we can see that we have another figure. And again, notice now we're at figure 2 because we've been interrupted with some tables, but we had our first figure to begin with. We have a 3.3. We have another figure, another 2 figures as a matter of fact. And then we get to the discussion. Sort of something else to be thinking about here. Notice that so for all of their 3.1, 2, 3, and I think there was a 3.4, maybe it was only 3.1, 2, and 3. Each of those sections included some graphical information, right? They included either a table or 2, or they included a figure or a figure of 2. So they, again, thinking about that consistency and making sure that they're explaining or they're describing their results in both a visual as well as a verbal format. Discussion. And I went to the University of California, Irvine for this because I thought they did a pretty good job of cohesively sort of summarizing this. The purpose of the discussion offers, and I should have highlighted the word variations of the following goals: to interpret the principles, relationship, generalizations, to identify exceptions or lack of correlations, and to interpret why you think this is so. By the way, sometimes this doesn't happen in the discussion, and hopefully I'll point that out when we get to the conclusion. To explain how your results agree or disagree with previously published works. Remember, we had the literature review that opened up in the introduction. This is a place where that might become relevant to us again. And then to discuss the theoretical implications of your work as well as practical applications. So let's stop here. Let's go back to our article again. And I'm going to ask you folks so I've highlighted some things. Notice this is broken into sections too. So and you could scroll down further than I am. So does this discussion in the published research, does it seem to do the kinds of things I was just saying could be possible goals? And I probably asked that poorly. when I'm in a traditional classroom, my students just stare at me strangely, and I realize the question I posed is impossible to answer. Well, so let me point out one thing here, because I don't want to make it feel bad or quiz-like to people. So remember one of the things, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say remember, we just looked at it. So let's just go back really quickly here. To explain how your results or disagree with previously published works. So one of the things that they do in their discussion is very early on in it, the current case study investigated while similar studies have done other things, and notice they go back to the literature they might have cited earlier, the subtropical location, blah, blah, blah. This study also did something else, right? So they're saying, although some of these things have been done, we're doing something different or we're doing something more. And in addition, we identified some other things. And then they certainly point out, while future research is needed, meaning this isn't the end all of what it is we're talking about, we provide an overview of how this can be used to understand, and it sets the stage for future investigations. So in some ways, this discussion, this one paragraph now sets the stage of how they're going to lay out things in 4.1 and so forth. And now again, so what's happening here is more of an interpretation of the data, or if you prefer data, I don't know why I say data.
And Brett, this is a question. There's someone post a question in the chat, if you can see.
Oh, sure.
That.
Let me see.
That was from Ram at University of Michigan.
So is this the one? Okay, wait, hold on. Let me just see. Start. So how do you recommend handling methods if your method 2 is based on results from method 1? I had this situation where I had to mention that if method 1 is successful, then conduct method 2 with some inputs from method 1. Oh, that's a really good question. In fact, I just had an undergraduate, we were doing annotated bibliographies in my undergraduate course for technical writers. It's possible you could actually have, if you have multiple methods, right? When, let's say the methods don't build on each other the way that this particular article's, the student I'm thinking about, she had an article that she was looking at where it had a methods section, and then it had the results of that method, and then it had a second methods section. And what was just interesting is they didn't call them methods, they called them something else, and I can't remember exactly what they did. And I don't know, does that kind of, I mean, that to me is one way to get around that. Let me go on with the rest of this question. However, I was not sure if I should have explained results from method 1 to explain method 2, because I thought going ahead and explaining method 2 would presume that method 1 would be successful. So I don't know, does that make sense, this notion? And maybe Tom, you could even jump in on this too with publications, because I'm not as familiar with research specifically in these fields, but this notion of having 2 different methods.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be very field dependent, and I almost would want to, I would almost want to turn to one of our more experienced trainees who may have, I don't know if Alana is still on or following along, whether she might comment on that, but that's going to be really discipline and maybe even journal dependent. So I don't know if I didn't want to put Alana on the spot if she's still here, but.
Well, I put you on the spot, but I'm just
Yes.
that wasn't my intention to do that. But it's one of those complicated, questions that comes up when we're conducting research, and it's it doesn't fit the nice, neat little paradigm. But again, if you're comfortable using the 2 methods, I mean, this is the thing. I always just, whenever I'm thinking, especially about scientific writing, because it already can become very. When I say convoluted, I mean convoluted to people outside the various fields, but to be really clear about what you're doing with those roadmaps. So for example, if I had to do something like this in the last paragraph of the introduction, where I say sometimes we'll set up in section 1, here's what we're going to do. In section 2, here's what I'm going to do. In section 3, here's what we're going to do. Because in that way, even if it seems, wow, remember we were talking about expectations. Well, it's not what I expected to see. But now you've clarified for me why it's not what I expect to see, and I'm probably going to be okay with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is probably, I don't know how much time you want to take with this, because it is a really kind of a unique and sticky situation. But I like, Brett, I not to put words in your mouth, but I like the idea that it is it's your job as an author to help explain it as clearly as possible to the audience. And so I think as long as you're explaining what you're about to do and why you are approaching it that way, that at least gets you in the door. You know, whether the reviewers buy into that is anybody's guess when you actually
Right.
submit it. So
And Ram said thanks. in
yeah.
the chat.
So anyway, yeah, really good,
Again,
really interesting question.
It is,
Yeah.
it is, and an unexpected one. And I actually can't believe, by the way, it's not that I'm so smart. I can't believe that I actually had an undergraduate student that just recently had run into a similar thing. So I actually could make sense of what you were asking. But Ram, one other thing I would just mention before we move on to this, if you did set it up that way and you set it up clearly, even if the peer reviewers, perhaps that they don't want to see it separated that way, I think if you're clear about why you set it up, they're not going to reject your research. They may send it back to you saying, we would like to see some changes, if that makes sense. So again, that sort of clarity, just being clear about what it is that you're doing.
Yeah, that does. Thank you.
So anyway, we're going, again, they've broken down their discussion into these different points that they wanted to make. And you notice I didn't really hide everything from their interpretations, but I did want to get to the point. I was pointing out that first paragraph basically was setting up the order that we would see things here in the discussion. And notice, so they mentioned what we've done provides a point of entry for future work, and that's exactly where they end up talking here. A better understanding is needed. Future investors should consider our study's results as well as the following, and then they make 2 points that you want to be thinking about here. And then you notice they make sort of what I would say is sort of the move outward again, the move toward where we started in that very first paragraph, where they're making, this is again, just sort of the implication, the proper management of the beach through targeted monitoring and early warning systems is necessary. This invest demonstrated that blah, blah, blah. The results presented will be important to future water quality investigations, as well as to the development of the spatial and temporal components of predictive models that aim to improve forecasting and blah, blah, blah. I just want to mention one quick thing about this before we move on in case we run out of time or I forget to mention it later. This is a place where these researchers understand that the research that they're conducting is useful and necessary for people who are not in their discipline. It could be policymakers, it could be land developers, it could be just citizens at the beach. It's important to other people, and therefore, even though they're presenting this in this scientific setting, they understand that they may have to translate, to use probably not the exact word I want to use, that information to another kind of audience. But they're pointing out how that information is necessary for audiences beyond people just interested in their specific research. And then let's just kind of, conclusion does what you think it should. It reminds you what you've read, and it identifies the important implications for the research. And I think that that's what this one does here. And this is an interesting conclusion to me because basically they just take our main findings were, and they summarize everything up in bullets, and notice that they actually end with a bullet. They do include some supplementary materials. Sometimes you'll have folks that will have sometimes you will have, not very often, but sometimes you'll have scientific articles that will have their entire methods section in a supplementary material. This is relevant to their methods, by the way. They include acknowledgements. They talk about author contributions, and they also notice that they include a conflicts of interest statement here. Again, not all journals require that, but I thought it was really, one of the reasons I picked this article is because they did. And then just quick thing about the references, I wanted to mention this. I remember I told you that the bracketed numbers we were seeing throughout the text corresponded with these numbers here. Again, so they went with the order that they discussed them as opposed to going in alphabetical order. That numbering, or that way of presenting the references, again, relevant to IEEE, and as I think it was Louisa pointed out, a couple of other styles as well. That said, they actually follow something very close to APA formatting for their actual bibliographic records. And it's kind of a combination of APA and MLA. APA would have had the year right after the author's names, but like, for example, the italicics of the volumes without using the word volume, that's a very APA or MLA sort of thing to do. again, the point here is the style system, the citation system was specific to the journal, and you need to follow the journal's instructions rather than assuming the style or the format that you're used to using is the one that they're going to accept.
And Brett, you'll see Tom just added a post in there about seeing more and more conflict of interest requirements in journals, especially in NIH-related research.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, Tom. That's a really good point to mention, too, especially now because, and I think this could even have things to do with, although I haven't, and maybe you can correct me, or any of you can correct me. I've often wondered if there should be mention of like the IRBs or something like that in the articles as well. You know, did you have permission like to use? I think about that because it's something completely unrelated to our conversation, but I was really interested in my undergraduate students who are doing service learning projects, and my students are usually working with kids, you know, under 18, and it's impossible for me to get approval to do things because the kids are under 18, so I can't use results from any of the stuff that I'm there. Anyway, so that's the conclusion. Now, and I'm going to skip this part because you guys are going to have access to this information anyway. But I wanted to make sure now, if we could take a minute, I'm going to put the burden on you all for the next 15 minutes, if we need that much time, to think about, in addition to, for example, having to, you're writing your own research paper or writing a conference paper, which, by the way, would follow all of the same sorts of things we were just talking about for the published original research. The main difference maybe with a conference paper is often the conclusions might be preliminary. One of the reasons you might actually be presenting at a conference is you're still maybe trying to figure some of the conclusions out. You actually present at conferences a lot of times, unless people are very contentious. But usually conferences can be very sort of helpful at pointing out maybe, for example, a flaw in my method, or it's something I overlooked in my results, or I interpreted something, but I neglected to look at something else. But those would be, but that's the structure of your conference paper and the structure of your published article would be the same. So anyway, so so I put in example one, and you guys can certainly apply them any way you want. But when I was looking over some of the things that you're doing for your IDP activities, I thought to myself, well, this is relevant, for example, to the individual development activity of the proposal or the grant application preparation. Anyone doing that, and anyone know why I would think that that's relevant? And just because I think it's relevant, I guess, doesn't mean it is.
They hear IDP and they don't want to listen anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Their eyes are glazing over when they see IDP.
So, okay, so I'll just point out sort of what I thought of when I looked at it. And the reason I think caught it is because you actually in the individual development activity file that I looked at, when it talked about proposal and the proposal/grant application preparation, it talked about conducting a literature review. And so one of the things that would be sort of relevant, you know, because if you're trying to get, applied for, some sort of like money or something, you're still going to have to provide, here's what we know about, whatever it is I want to do right now. And you probably are going to have to provide some sort of, what's the approach you're going to take? You might not be confirmed exactly the methods you're going to use, but you probably have some idea. And you probably would also speculate. I mean, again, the results would be completely speculative, but what do you think you're going to find? Right. So again, if you're trying to do some of those things. And as far as the challenge project, I looked at I looked at this one simply because I'm interested in community service or civic engagement, things from just at an undergraduate level and not in the specificity of your various fields. But the notion that when you get involved in a community service activity, I mean, you can almost think of that. I don't want to say it's the same thing as advocacy, but advocacy campaigns begin with doing the research. You can't go in and say, here's what we need to do in your community, right? We're going to help you do this without having the research. And by the way, I think you guys probably know this even better than I do, you're actually involved in these things. You never want to be involved in a research project that doesn't involve the community that it's hoping to serve. And then the last point I'll make had to do with this. And can you guys, Kristen and Tom, maybe just confirm? I realize I looked at the ones from 2020, but these projects are things, these are ongoing, correct? That they're still great. So one of the things, and for all of you who are elsewhere, all of you who are attending this here, I'm guessing that you've looked at some of these already, or even a more recent version of them. Well, one of the things that when I went through and I was looking at these is that, so you have like whoever the faculty, I made it sound dismissive, whoever the faculty, mentor is, but it goes down right then. You have a teaching research professor, maybe you have an assistant research professor, but then you have like a postdoc, you have a dissertation candidate, right? That are all talking about the research. And I looked for project number 1, for example, the 2 students, and I don't mean that in a dismissive ways, but the 2 folks who were actually working on their degrees were actually from very different fields. Their fields actually varied from the person who actually was organizing, who was the leader of the project. And it emphasized that notion of research, one, being collaborative, and also a term, and again, Tom, Kristen, correct me, you focus on the word transdisciplinary. Is that correct? Is that a term that you use as opposed to, for example, interdisciplinary?
Yes, and this has been the topic of discussion recently too, Bret.
Okay, yeah, and this is the notion, and I may misunderstand the way you all are using it, but from my experience, I really like the term the transdisciplinary, because this makes whatever it is that we're doing in terms of like this scientific research, we want to make it applicable and I don't want to say to the humanities as a discipline, but to humanities, meaning that we're talking about real people, and real people are also sort of involved in this. They are stakeholders, if you will, and whatever it is our projects are all about.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of stating it. When we found lots of confusion when we started looking at transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary. So I think it's probably something we're going to have to continue to discuss as we move through the year at least. Yeah, and so by the way, if that's something you're interested in, just so you know, I'm just going to make sure I still this. I'm sorry, I'm looking at my. Can you see that I'm now looking at my links here on my website? We cannot. We're still seeing your slide of example number 3. Anyway, I actually had 2 things I'm looking it up. There was a 3-part series of articles about. It's called multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, and transdisciplinarity in health research, services, education, and policy. And again, it's like one with, for example, I'm looking number 1, definition, projected evidence. The third one was called discipline, interdiscipline distance, and selection of disciplines. But they talk about why these are very sort of confusing terms. And they also talk about how you go about making them work. One of the things, I'll just tell you something that says, I think it's interesting. This is from the number 3. In their results, they say, a discipline is held together by shared epistemology. In general, disciplines that are more disparate from one another epistemologically are more likely to achieve new insights for a complex problem. And I just thought that was really, and again, I thought a reason that stood out for me, and again, I was thinking about in terms of what you all are doing with Protect and stuff, was this notion that, maybe this notion that transdisciplinary is really a way to go. Anyway, sorry.
Can you send that link? I would love to be able to quote that, because that is Protect in a nutshell.
Yes, I will definitely do that. In fact, I think I'm going to just copy it here, and let's see if I can put that into the chat. So I just put the link in the chat, and if somebody just wants to click on it, it's not the full article, but it has the abstract. And it's titled Multidisciplinarity, Interdisciplinarity, and Transdisciplinarity. Do you get access to that? Perfect.
Yep.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Yeah.
Of course. I learned it was a good thing because when I saw you guys using that term transdisciplinary, I thought I'd heard that before, and I think it should be used more often. But I needed to make sure I understood why I thought it should be used more often.
So, and one more, by the way, we're not going to do the recap because as you probably already experienced, we went back and forth between the article and my slides already. Also, I just want to point out, I've included the resources here, and Kristen's also, if she hasn't already, was going to upload one more artifact that I want you to have. And this has to do with this article. It's called A Comparison of Practitioner and Student Writing in Civil Engineering by Susan Conrad. And I think you'll find it interesting for just a couple of reasons. One, it's fairly recent. It's from April of 2017. And Susan Conrad is actually the director or founder of the very first resource I list here, the Civil Engineering Writing Project out of Portland State University. And I'm from Seattle, so I'm biased toward anything along the Pacific Northwest, but it was very interesting. And reason I wanted you to be thinking about this, I just shared the results from her article here. Again, this is from the abstract. Student writing had more complicated sentence structures, less accurate word choice, more errors in grammar and punctuation, and less linear organization. These characteristics decreased effectiveness in areas that practitioners considered important: accurate and unambiguous content, fast, predictable reading. By the way, question that's me, editorialized, liability management, and attention to detail. Underlying student writing problems were misconceptions about effective writing, ignorance of genre expectations, and so forth. And so one of the reasons I wanted you to look at this is I think she does a good job of pointing out sometimes as students, we may tend to write, or even as professionals, we may be at the place in our career where we still think of ourselves too much as students. And so we rely on things that we did as students, as opposed to thinking about what are if I'm writing a scientific paper, how do I make sure that, sure, it's complicated stuff I'm talking about, but I still want people to understand what I'm talking about, right? And the other reason I picked this is because one of the things that she does with this article, and she does it in another article too, but in a different kind of way. When we were talking about the scientific writing, or at least when I was talking about the scientific writing and I shared that article with you, we were talking about the people behind it as researchers. She's making a distinction here on some level between researchers and practitioners, if that makes sense. And the reason I want you to all to be aware of that is so you might consider yourselves, depending on your IDPs, which I guess you don't want to talk about too much, I don't know. But you might be saying to yourself, well, I'm actually not, I don't see myself having a research role in my professional career. I may see myself, again, that sort of practitioner mode, whatever it is you'd be practicing in your field of study of things. So anyway, I thought that you might find that to be useful or helpful. I think it's an interesting distinction to make. Anytime people complicate like the experts and the students, and they break that dichotomy up by pointing out there are multiple kinds of experts, I think that's a great way to be thinking about writing.
I think if I could just jump in, I think it will be like a lot of Protect. There will be some parts of Protect that are going to be highly research oriented and probably won't be as practitioner directed. Whereas in some of the fields, there are audiences from both inside research, but also unfortunately spanning across. So it's going to depend on the discipline in a lot of cases that the student is in. And a lot of them are going to know that from socializing with their advisor, kind of the world that they have to live in or address through their journal articles. Yeah, but it's a great point.
Any other questions as we come to the end here? Comments? Bret, I want to say thank you. I really learned a lot. I like hearing this type of a presentation and really appreciate it. And Louisa just said excellent presentation. And what we're going to do, and she said thank you, we are going to post a recording of this online, and also I'll make sure that those resources become available on our website too, because I think those can be useful. Irene, Scarlett all said thank you as well. So thanks very much.
Yeah, Bret, thanks so much. As always, this is a terrific way for students to really be our trainees to be thinking about how to move forward. And as I said, all of them are under some, either some pressure or motivation, hopefully motivation and inspiration to write in their fields as part of
Good.
either a thesis or an article. So this is a great way for them to start really thinking about how to get at that in a
Great.
way that isn't overwhelming. So thanks for making
Great.
this a really manageable process.
And
And
one
well,
last
thank you all.
question. Can
Oh,
we
sure.
share the slides as well? Can we?
Yes, in fact, that's just what I wanted to end with and
Okay.
say. So Chris, and the reason I didn't mention that earlier, just so you know, Kristen, but I can disclose it to everybody. As I was going through it, I'm saying to myself, if you see a typographical error or you see something you need to fix, make sure that we don't share it yet. But actually, I didn't catch anything. And if somebody else did, just don't tell me you did. But yeah, I think feel free to share the slide deck. Yeah.
Okay, great. I'll put it in the chat right now as we all exit, but we'll also put it on the website. And thank you very
Okay.
much.
Thanks, Brett.
Thank you, everybody.
Have a
It was-
great weekend.
Everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.